Have you ever felt like your entire life was destroyed with a single click of a mouse? I did. One day I opened my bank account, and it was empty. Someone had stolen my money, my savings, my future. I thought it was the end. But I didn't know the most important thing. The one who did this had no idea who they had messed with. They were hackers. But I had my own secrets too. And my hunt was just beginning. At first, I felt powerless. Imagine staring at your computer screen, watching the numbers drop to zero, realizing that years of hard work had just evaporated. My chest tightened, my hands shook, and all I could hear was the echo of my own heartbeat. For hours, I sat there in silence, thinking maybe it was a glitch, maybe the bank would fix it, maybe there was hope. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had deliberately targeted me. The first thing I did was call the bank. They confirmed what I feared. A series of transfers had been made to anonymous wallets, bouncing through servers in places I'd only read about. Their tone was sympathetic, but empty. To them, I was just another victim. To me, it was personal. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I pulled out my old laptop, the one I hadn't touched in years. Back then, before life got busy, I used to spend hours diving into forums, teaching myself about coding, encryption, and even hacking. I never considered myself a professional, but I knew enough to understand how the game worked. And if they thought I was just another helpless target, they were about to learn otherwise. The first step was to follow the trail. Hackers think they're invisible, but arrogance makes people sloppy. I started with the last transaction and slowly peeled back layers of fake accounts and hidden servers. It was like walking through a maze where every turn led to another locked door. But I knew something they didn't. Every system, no matter how secure, has a weakness. After 2 sleepless nights, I found my first crack, a server they hadn't protected well enough. It wasn't much, just a fragment of metadata, but it gave me a location. Eastern Europe. That was a start. I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. Whoever they were, they'd taken everything from me. But now I had their scent. Still, I wasn't reckless. I knew charging in blindly would get me burned. So I played the waiting game. I created decoy accounts, set up digital traps, and patiently watched their movements online. Every day, I learned more about them, what time they logged in, what kind of systems they used, even what kind of mistakes they made when they thought nobody was watching. That's when I realized something. This wasn't just one hacker. It was a group. A whole network of thieves who made a living stealing from people like me. And I wasn't just going to get my money back. No. I was going to burn their entire operation to the ground. One night, while monitoring their server, I noticed something strange. A careless slip. Someone connected without using their usual VPN. And for the briefest second, their real IP address flashed across my screen. My pulse raced as I traced it, and froze. It wasn't some random hacker halfway across the world. It was closer than I ever imagined. The signal came from a city not more than a few hundred miles away. They were practically in my backyard. At that moment, I knew my hunt wasn't just digital anymore. It was about to get real. And I was ready. Finding them wasn't the same as finding comfort. Once I had a city name, a neighborhood, a shadow of a lead, everything shifted from theory to motion. I closed my laptop for the first time in days, shoved a charger and a change of clothes into a backpack, and left my apartment with the single-purpose calm of someone who had set a clock to wake at exactly the right second. I didn't tell friends. I told only one person. A reporter I'd met months earlier at a community meeting, the kind of journalist who hates injustice and loves a puzzle. She didn't ask how I'd traced them, she just asked when. We agreed to be careful. She had contacts where I didn't. A courier who knew streets like veins, a photographer who could vanish in plain sight, and a lawyer friend who promised to be on standby if anything legally dicey came up. The city was smaller than I expected and dirtier in ways that made me think of spent plants. I rented a cheap room above a bakery, the air thick with yeast and coffee, the kind of place where you can watch people without being watched yourself. From that window I started the slow work of watching watchers. I walked the streets, went into cafes and listened for names. The network moved like a nervous animal, small, quick patterns repeating at odd hours. I did not try to hack them again. I had no desire to be a criminal. The work I did was old-fashioned. Observation, patience, and a willingness to play a role. I became a buyer of small stolen goods, a man with cash and no questions, an attractive mark. I sent signals in the right channels, not instructions, not scripts, but just enough to get their interest. They liked people who seemed easy. Arrogance is a universal language. One evening a contact took me to a cluttered warehouse on the edge of town. The man in the doorway sized me up with the bored confidence of someone who had seen fools come and go. He didn't know me yet, and that ignorance was an asset. Inside, the place smelled of plastic and oil. Pallets, boxes, a back room lit by a bare bulb. Men moved with a rhythm that said they were used to offloading things quickly and quietly. I stayed on the edges, keeping my head low and my phone higher. I watched faces, not screens. I learned who spoke first, who listened, who flailed when things went wrong. I traded small talk for names. A careless laugh. A mention of a drop in the suburbs. It all added up. I had proof now, not the forensic type a lab would like, but the human kind that points fingers without needing technical detail. Receipts, routes, a ledger photographed under a coffee cup. That night, back in the hotel, I pieced the fragments together. I arranged them like puzzle pieces on a table until a map formed. Courier routes, drop sites, the name of a shell company used to launder payments. The reporter worked her side the way detectives do, quietly pushing, asking, making calls. We were building a narrative solid enough that law enforcement would have to take notice. And then the lawyer called with a line I'd been waiting for. We can move, but only if we do it legally. No traps that could backfire. No entrapment. If you want them out, we build a case. That was the signal. We were not vigilantes. We were witnesses, strategists, and organizers of a very public reckoning. We planned a sting that relied on their greed and their arrogance instead of violence. It would be a meeting, a supposed big buyer for a batch of tickets and devices. We created a cover, a fake charity gala organizer wanting to buy back prizes, to make things right. The bait was their chance to profit and to feel cunning again. The reporter drafted the pitch, the lawyer prepped the legal steps, the detective arranged to have his team on nearby streets, ready to act when we had probable cause. On the day, I felt like a man rehearsing a role he'd play all his life. I walked into the warehouse with cash rolled in my pocket and an actor's calm. The men were there, already impatient, thinking the job would be another routine hustle. Pavel's name came up in passing, and for a moment my pulse jumped, a familiar itch of triumph. But I kept my face neutral. I played the part, interested, slightly overeager, a man who had been scammed and now wanted to buy his way into a fix. We did not break any laws. We recorded conversations in public, photographed documents when offered, and ensured every exchange happened where there were witnesses. When one of them dropped a ledger or discussed drop times aloud, the detective began to move. Officers in plain clothes filtered in the perimeter. It was clinical, the way arrests often are behind the scenes. Polite requests, clear voices, the slow application of cuffs. Chaos didn't erupt. That was almost disappointing, for them at least. They weren't dramatic criminals. They were small-time operators with big mouths. But that lack of drama is what made them more dangerous in the long run. They relied on the assumption that people won't bother to follow. Now they had police notebooks, recorded evidence, and the reporter's article ready to run the next morning. We watched them taken away one by one, not as some vengeful mob, but as a community that had learned how to use systems against predators. It was satisfying, sterile, and permanent in a way that fistfights never are. Yet even as officers led them to cars, one thing pulled at me, a piece of paper tucked in a jacket pocket that listed another name, a name I hadn't expected. It was not a name from the warehouse, not a pawn shop owner, not the courier. It was someone in my own city. Someone who'd stayed quiet while the net spun. Someone who had the means to rebuild what we'd broken. That night the hunger returned. The arrests were not the end so much as a trench in a longer war. Some of the men were behind bars, their operations disrupted, but the head, the man moving money through legitimate fronts, the one who had treated people like me as targets, he was still out there. I could have rested. I could have let the detectives keep the folders and the court dates. But patience had become addictive. The hunt had sharpened something in me that had nothing to do with money now. It was about making sure the whole web unraveled, not just the visible threats. So I did what I had done before, I stretched the net. I handed what we had to the DA and then kept watching. I fed small tips to the reporter so the visibility never waned. I visited pawn shops under the guise of a curious buyer. I nudged people who'd once looked the other way into remembering what happens when a system protects itself. Slowly, inexorably, the circle tightened. Papers led to accounts. Accounts led to shell companies. Shell companies pointed back to a downtown office that, on paper, shipped legal goods and in practice washed ill-gotten gains. That office's manager was slippery, but when colleagues began to whisper and the reporter knocked on doors, that slipperiness turned to fear. People who had once shared a cigarette with him started to avoid eye contact. Weeks later, after court motions and filings, we had more than arrests. We had indictments for a handful of people higher on the ladder. The legal system, which moves like a glacier, had finally sensed a heat source. Its wheels, bureaucracy, subpoenas, audits, began grinding in our favor. When charges were filed, the city seemed different for a moment, Smaller, cleaner, more honest. I didn't celebrate with champagne. Instead, I sat at my usual coffee shop, notebook open, and listened to conversations that now felt safer. The reporter's piece ran a long feature about networks of small-time hustles and the people who fight them. Comments poured in. Victims thanked us, others sent tips, and a few brave souls offered testimony. There was still work ahead. The man who organized the payments was still out there, and one of his attorneys had just filed a motion that would drag parts of the case into delay. But the momentum was on our side, and momentum is a stubborn force. The months after the indictments blurred into a rhythm of hearings, subpoenas, and slow victories. The men from the warehouse sat in courtrooms like small, embarrassed statues. The DA handed down charges, and one by one the foot soldiers began to take plea deals. Newspapers ran follow-ups. My inbox filled with messages from people who said, simply, "Thank you." Those words landed softer than I expected. Gratitude that felt like balm for nights I'd spent replaying the emptiness of my account. Still, the heart center of the scheme, the man who organized payments and cleaned the money through offices and shell accounts, remained a ghost. He had no flashy prints, no tattoos, no drunken bravado to snare. He was patient and polite on the phone, polite in his emails, and careful enough to keep distance between himself and the dirty work. The detective called him a cleaner, which had a ring of professional contempt. We called him, less kindly, the architect. Weeks of subpoenas eventually produced a thin thread. A bank transfer routed through a consultant's account, then split into smaller sums. The DA's accountants traced it to a courier company invoice that looked legitimate until you read between the lines. That was the leverage, paperwork that didn't fit the pattern. Someone somewhere had left a margin note in a hurry, and that note had a date. On that date, the architect had been photographed on a delivery dock by a clerk with an antiquated app. The photo was grainy and the man wore a cap, but the angle matched the courier's manifest. It was a tiny thing. It was enough. We built the case slowly, meticulously. The detective and the DA's team tied the ledger lines to invoices, the invoices to addresses, the addresses to a rented office with a receptionist who remembered a man with pale hands and a neat voice. The net closed like a fist. When the warrant finally dropped, it was a quiet morning. Officers moved through a midtown office block like a slow tide. The receptionist looked surprised but compliant. In the back office, among boxes of legitimate shipments, they found a laptop with encrypted folders, a binder of shell company paperwork, and a stack of printed spreadsheets that matched the ledger we'd found months earlier. He sat at his desk with a cup of tea, composed as if he'd been waiting for a visitor. They read him his rights. He didn't protest. He simply folded his hands and said, in a voice that sounded practiced for courtroom testimony, "I have nothing to say without counsel." The officers smiled the smile of people who have learned that silence is sometimes the loudest admission. When the architect's face hit the news, it didn't glow with the bravado of a villain in a movie. It looked like a man wearing the right trousers to a funeral. His arrest pulled at threads. A few more people were questioned. A couple of accounts froze. The DA called me in and said flatly, "We have enough to indict. This should stick." The trial was the slow, grinding machinery I'd expected. Witnesses testified, accountants explained wire trails, and the architect's lawyer argued technicalities and reasonable doubt like a sculptor shaping clay. I sat through it all, my chest a steady metronome between angry and numb. The day the verdict came down, I walked through the city as if under glass. The jury read the words, "Guilty on multiple counts." He was led away. The room felt strangely ordinary afterward. Chairs scraping, reporters packing, coffee cooling on tables. One of the victims stood up and hugged me in the hallway, her voice breaking. "You kept at it. You wouldn't let them do this to anyone else." I wanted to tell her I'd never meant to become a crusader. I wanted to tell her the hunt had started because I felt small and violated and too proud to accept it. Instead I nodded, and the gesture was enough. The aftermath was a slow settling. The DA pushed for restitution where it could, though money recovered was never the full truth of what had been lost. Some victims received partial returns. Others got the satisfaction of watching the men who'd hurt them held accountable. The reporter who had partnered with me went on to win a local award for investigative journalism. The cleaner who'd given me the storage room key received a commendation from the hotel for bravery. These were small lights on a long, dark road. And for me, the unspooling finally allowed something I hadn't had in months: perspective. Revenge had started as a hot animal inside me. It had crawled into my bones and made decisions for me. Over time it turned into something harder to recognize: responsibility. I had set out to get my money back. Instead I'd been dragged into a fight for other people's safety. I had become part of a community that refused to be prey. One evening, not long after the architect's sentencing, I sat on a bench overlooking the river. The city's lights lay like a spilled constellation. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd kept private, composed of the raw recordings, the photos from the warehouse, the receipts. I listened to one clip, the careless laugh that had first told me their names, and I let it play through not as fuel but as a marker of how far I'd come. A message popped up from the detective: "Case closed. Thanks." Short, formal, complete. I typed back one word: done. But endings are rarely neat. A year later, an email arrived from a stranger in another country. He wrote that his company had been targeted in a similar way and asked how we'd started. I paused. For a long time I wondered whether I should answer. Part of me wanted to keep the map of our hunt secret. Selfish, perhaps, but understandable. Another part of me knew what the cleaner and the DA had known: knowledge stops predators. I wrote back with a careful summary: report everything, preserve records, don't try to be a lone avenger. Work with detectives, journalists, and lawyers. Include the small detail that had mattered in our case. Keep recordings, even imperfect ones. Human behavior leaks in ways computers don't always cover. He thanked me and promised to pass it along. The message felt like a small repayment, an act of prevention. Months drifted on. The hotel where it all started updated its security policy and held workshops. The coffee shop I frequented had a new manager who locked up at closing. The cleaner received a promotion she never expected. Life again took up space in ordinary things. Dinners, work emails, a book read without the constant itch of surveillance. One night, a few of the victims, the woman who'd hugged me in the courthouse, a man who used to own a small electronics stall, and the barista who had tipped me off, met me for coffee. We sat and laughed over small things: the barista's new recipe, the stall owner's repaired booth, the woman's optimistic plan to travel next year. The conversation was easy. The trauma that had bonded us had softened into memory. On the way home I passed the hotel. The lobby glowed in warm light and children chased each other near the fountain. A staff member waved at me from across the room, a small acknowledgement that didn't need explanation. I felt the weight in my chest lift a fraction more. If you had asked me on the night I first saw Zero on my screen whether I'd become who I'd become, fueled by patience, legal strategy, and a stubborn refusal to be silenced, I might have laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound. Now, with the files archived and the men convicted, that laugh would be softer. Maybe it would even be a smile. Revenge did not bring back every lost hour. It did not return every cent in my bank account. But it changed the ledger in another way. It replaced helplessness with agency, fear with the calm that comes from something concluded. It taught me that the most effective payback is not spectacle, but the steady work that makes predators rethink the cost of their next move. I'd set out to win back what was mine. In the end, I helped make sure fewer people would be taken in the same way. That was close enough to justice.